Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Okay, now for the lightning round.
I'm so good at lightning rounds. That's from Friends. It's my favorite show.
20 seconds on the clock starts now. Who is the captain of the USS Enterprise?
Oh, crap. Is it, Captain Stubing? No, Morgan? Crunch?
Next question. Which superhero is Tony Stark?
Stark. Did Game of Thrones have superheroes? I only watched 2 episodes.
What planet were Luke and Leia born on?
Planet Fitness?
Oh, time's up. Sorry. And now, a word from our sponsor.
Hey everybody, Mandy Kaplan here. Please check out my podcast, Make Me a Nerd, where each week an incredible guest tries to baptize this mainstream mom into the world of sci-fi, fantasy, and all things nerdy. Available wherever you podcast.
That's our show, folks.
Wait, I just thought of it. Padme Amidala gave birth to her twins Luke and Leia on Polis Massa. No, that's dumb. Is it Planet Hollywood?
Hey Pete, ever wonder what Steven Spielberg's favorite film is?
You know, Andy, I've heard he loves classics like Lawrence of Arabia, Meet Me in St. Louis.
Imagine chatting with him about why those films resonate with him so much.
That's exactly what we do on our podcast, Movies We Like. We've had incredible guests like actress Dee Wallace, cinematographer Eric Messerschmidt, director Steve Miner, and former Disney animators Tom and Tony Bancroft.
They share their favorite films and the impact they've had on their careers, offering fascinating insights into the craftsmanship and storytelling techniques that make these movies so special.
If you're curious about the magic behind the scenes, subscribe to Movies We Like from True Story FM on your favorite podcast app. New episodes are released on the 4th Monday of each month with early access for our members.
Join us on Movies We Like as we explore the movies we all like with the people who make them.
And Stephen, our people will call your people. Let's make this happen, puppy.
Subscribe today.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Star Wars Generations Podcast. Today is November 6th, Wednesday, the day right after American Election Day. And, for no particular reason, the topic of rebellion and resistance and the fight against fascism and how we hold on to hope when it seems like no one is coming the way we thought they would is really on my heart right now. I know that Paul has a lot that they want to say. We're going to do this podcast and we have a loose idea of where we're going to go, but it's probably going to go in some interesting directions. And this will be, I think, a really important conversation to have, for everybody and anywhere around the world. But if you're American, if you're having a rough time today, I hope that this podcast hits you a little personal.
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way for sure. If you're happy about today, if you're happy about the election, like I want all of your listeners, I want all of your dollars, and maybe I'll get through to someone, but I'm just going to say, like, if you voted for Trump, you don't understand Star Wars. And calling yourself a Star, like, I don't know why you'd listen to this podcast if you vote for Trump, because it's kind of everything we're against, but I'll take your dollars anyway. So,
Or maybe you just thought the Empire was right. I mean, that's the thing. There's
we're going to talk about that right now.
Empire troopers.
So Paul, let me just ask you for you. Even at a young age, what did you understand about Star Wars in terms of this fight against the Empire and what all that was about?
Yeah, I feel like it always felt to me not just like good versus evil, like the heroes versus the villains, but also like a larger idea of fighting against oppression,
Right.
And as much as I do love the original trilogy, I feel like that time period, well, actually, I guess it's before that time period, but really gets that message through much more really in Andor, but also in Rebels as well. But the original movies had that feeling. And I think it was because, I understand that the idea behind the Empire was more supposed to be like Rome and stuff, right? But then also it was like the US and Vietnam, and also the imagery, I think, was meant to be evocative of Nazis, like stormtroopers, like jackbooted thugs,
right.
like it's
Like
So
stormtroopers, to be clear, the Nazi is a term that we kind of, I think other cultures had used it, but the
mhm,
Nazi SS were the
right,
English translation is stormtroopers, and
right.
so that name is a very specific reference.
Yeah. So, I think from the get-go, from literally the first movie, which came out before I was born, but
Right.
I saw all 3 movies when I was young, and Return of the Jedi in the theater. All of them, I feel there was this feeling of the Empire as, the Empire, like that the Empire was the villain, right? And it
Yeah.
wasn't just the Emperor who was the villain. It wasn't just Darth Vader who was the villain. Like the first movie, they're talking about bureaucracies and that like they've put the regional governors directly in charge. They've disbanded the Senate. It's like you never
Mhm.
see the Senate, right, in the
Yeah.
original movies, but it's referenced. I mean, there's like all this political stuff that's like
Yeah.
basically, this idea that there was some semblance of democracy, but it's broken down, and now you have this
Yeah.
villainous empire.
Fear will keep the other systems in line, was the line
Exactly.
that really hit me hard of like, "Oh, wait, no, that's not good. Like,
Right.
that's not what we're supposed to have."
Yeah. And obviously the line, the was it a retronym? I don't know. The name of the first movie, which was originally just released as Star Wars, I think,
Mhm.
right? But A New Hope, it is, I think, pretty clearly trying to deliver the message that like, there's no successful rebellion, there's no revolution without hope. Like you
Right.
have to believe that you can succeed. And like
Right.
I don't think you have to believe that you will succeed, but I think you
Right.
have to believe that you can, that it is a possibility and that it's a possibility worth fighting for, dying for, killing for, like whatever, basically.
Mhm.
And so exactly what they were fighting for wasn't super clear, like freedom, or like, but
Mhm.
basically not being under the boot of this empire, right? And,
Right.
over time, the idea of it being this colonial empire that, was expanding into different worlds and oppressing more and more cultures in different places, I think became clear. And I think Return of the Jedi actually was the first move that really made that feel clear, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, because Tatooine, it's kind of hard to see sort of like really what the culture is there, but like,
Mhm.
you see the Ewoks, you meet them, face to face, and then you see them fighting the Empire. And
Yeah.
um,
And specifically, like, you earlier commented on how, like, one way of understanding this was a fight, like, that the Americans were the empire and that the rebellion was the Viet Cong.
mhm.
That's not something that we lefties are, like, putting onto it later.
Yeah, no,
George
yeah,
Lucas specifically said that,
yeah,
and I think that, probably I was born after Vietnam, obviously, but I was born in an era when Vietnam, I think, was a much more prevalent part of the conversation, and I was
hmm,
always watching news clips about it or movies about it. And, like, one of the things that was really well known to me, even at, like, a pretty young age, was that, like, a lot of the struggle was this very militarized, technology US Army fighting against, the phrase that some American general used was little men in black pajamas.
hmm,
And it was these, like, you know, people using sticks and traps and very low
yeah,
technology. And
and knowledge of the terrain though as well,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Like using nature and
Yeah,
and an understanding of that. And a disease was horrible for the US Army.
hmm,
And I don't think you can watch if you have that. Like, I don't think I knew that at 6, but probably by the time I was 9, I could connect that.
yeah,
And watching the Ewoks use literally trees in various forms to fight the Star Wars equivalent of the M1 Abrams tank. Uh, how can that not be? It's such a powerful message of it doesn't matter that they have all the strength and they have all the technology that we can still defeat them.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And then you have lightsabers and the Force, and
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
and that's like cool looking, and it's like the idea that like there's something kind of extra. I think that can do a lot, and that the power of basically positive emotions, and but also the power of negative emotions, right? The power of anger
Yeah.
and hate, and that those are um very powerful things. And I think as time's gone on, there's been more sort of thought about like, well, are those things that you can use productively, or as opposed to the idea that they just lead to the dark side, and that, it's
Right.
kind of a one-way path. And like, is there any real reason that would tie in directly to the Empire, or is it just that the Empire happens to be run by, a couple Sith?
Right.
And that's stuff, though, I feel like came more later in terms of that
Mm-hmm.
interpretation of it. But the idea of, from, I think, in high school is when I came back to it. Like, as a little
Yeah.
kid, like 5, 6, 7, maybe 8, I was really into Return of the Jedi, and then Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. But it was in high school when, especially when I had a character for the Masquerade, which was the live action version of Vampire the Masquerade, this role playing game character, who was
Mm-hmm.
the character was really into Darth Vader, which was
Yeah.
funny because he had been an anti-fascist
Yeah.
in the Spanish Civil War. He was an anarchist. That my character, who then became very kind of fascist as a sort of reaction of like having lost that war, and then sort of
Yeah.
like, okay, well, if that didn't work, then we're gonna kind of try things this way. I'm not sure the entirety of that irony was all there in my brain yet, but I do have a series of fiction that perhaps someday I'll get around to writing,
Mm-hmm.
from that character's point of view, like as a fictional. Anyway, I digress. The point being, I got back into especially The Empire Strikes Back. Like, I got really
Yeah.
into that movie, and this is kind of where we started talking about it. This was high school, right?
Yeah.
When we met around that time, in high school, and I remember like that one conversation between Vader and Luke, join me, we'll throw,
Mm-hmm.
we'll overthrow the Emperor, right? And
Yeah.
like, but then we'll do something good together. Kind of like, I'm doing this thing with the Emperor, but that's just because like I have to. But like, if you join me, then we could get rid of that guy, and then we could like do it right, and
Right.
like that was
And it's not overthrow the empire. The
right,
line is, and rule together as father and
right.
son. It's still
Restore
about, we're going to be the authoritarians,
exactly.
but we'll be benevolent authoritarians.
Right. That was like when it became clear to me that like, oh, Darth Vader like thinks he's doing the right thing. Like, he
Yeah.
thinks he's doing something that's good, and he's using these means of violence and intimidation and fear to restore order. Like,
Mm-hmm.
legitimately thinks that this is the way.
Right. I will say that we're kind of here talking about the original movies and our reactions to them, but I'm going to do something I very rarely do on this podcast, which is praise Attack of the Clones, which is generally considered my least favorite of the Star Wars movies, except possibly Rise of Skywalker, which has nothing to do with Rey, to be clear. Because in that movie, you see a direct line of how Anakin becomes that Vader. Because, and this is even more so if you watch the Clone Wars, but even just in that movie, he's having these conversations with Padme where he is so frustrated by the Senate gridlock. He's so frustrated, and he goes on this rant about like, we should just let the politicians get together and decide what is right, and then they'll all do the right thing. And when Padme says, but what if they disagree? He says, then they should be made to disagree.
To agree, made to agree, right?
Yeah, made
Yeah.
to agree, exactly. And it's both, it's a very much like the dark side, it's a very seductive mindset. It makes sense. And living in this country the last however many years of seeing our Congress not able to do anything, our government so often stuck and just unable to deal with real problems and just fighting and fighting and fighting, I get the seduction of that mindset. But all that mindset is about is the idea that there's any one right way to fix things. And the problem is people do disagree, because often one group's right way of doing things is to say like, hooray for us and fuck all of them. And or whatever it is, or just like, hey, we're going to take their stuff, or just they shouldn't take our stuff, or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, it's usually about stuff. Stuff's the big part of it.
It's about stuff. It's about pride. It's about how do we feel about ourselves, and how do them having some power make us feel about ourselves. It's all of that. And yeah, I think it is one of the most brilliant. There's so much about the prequels that I didn't like, or I felt like they were trying to do a message, but I wanted them to do it better. But that message of how does Anakin become the person in Empire Strikes Back who thinks that Luke would want to join him to rule the galaxy, and that maybe that would be good for the galaxy. It makes so much sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the flaw is there is in execution, and just like the dialogue and the acting and just how it comes together. But in terms
Yeah.
of understanding the character, I'm with you 100%. And
Yeah.
and I do think like the prequels set up like the whole timeline thing. I've got huge issues with the timeline, and it
Yeah.
just the timeline just doesn't work for me. But setting that aside, I do think like that show, and I think the Clone Wars show more of how Anakin goes from having that mindset that he gets in Attack of the Clones to actually being able to go where he goes in Revenge of the Sith.
Right.
I feel like the movies, there's like some dots that are kind of left out, and again, it falls down in the execution for me. But
Yeah.
in terms of the themes, like it does, like on paper, I feel like it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I do feel like everybody thinks their own like there's the hero in the story, pretty much.
Yeah.
Right, like they're doing the right thing for the most part. I mean, so I don't think that's always the case. I think a lot of people actually do what they want to do, and they have a lot of guilt about what they decide to do, and they don't think they're doing the right thing but can't necessarily help it. And for some people that manifests in like having an extra brownie, and in other people that manifests in like oppressing other people. It's like
Yeah.
similar, but not the same. But
Yeah.
but overall, I do think people like start from a point of like thinking this is, and they might even like be able to feel selfless about it, like, oh well, we're going to oppress that group for our kids. It's
Right.
not for us, it's for our kids. It's for the
Right.
next generations and whatever, and or for our country, this is this bigger, or for the empire or whatever.
And so much of that, I think, is about fear. It's
Yeah.
about people being afraid and other people manipulating that fear. Because to me, all of the chaos of the Clone Wars was caused by the Jedi. It was always their fault. If you help me wipe out the Jedi, then I can take care of everything and we'll be okay again. And it's all the fault of the Jews. Help me take care of them, I can make Germany okay again. Or it's all the fault of the trans people and the queer people, and I can help make America great again. Those are the exact same arguments every time. And I think that is, people will believe they're doing the right thing in terms of a positive thing. And I think it's possible to help be like, no, this is good for everybody. But I think fear is an even more powerful. Like, if you convince someone that there's a group to be afraid of, then any and all things you do to that group are okay because you're protecting everyone else from this great fear.
Yeah, and it's a fear of like loss of resources, right? And loss of control and loss of power, which then, I think for an organization or people or a culture or whatever that's used to being the oppressor, I think there's a natural, not entirely illogical, but like a sense of, oh, well, if we've had the power and we've been oppressing, then if we give up the power, then we'll naturally be the oppressed, right? Like there's this lack of an awareness that there's the possibility to either A, share power, or B, that someone else might be able to have power and not use it to oppress, right? That's like actually a thing. And some people don't believe that.
Yeah. It's the,
I think it's
when
a
you
rare
hear
thing, but
when you hear Black Lives Matter, what you think is, so therefore I matter less.
right.
Because you've lived most of your life without actually thinking this, but being kind of, if you're white, being kind of subtly told you do matter more, and like, and we'll get back to the Star Wars of it all, but I think this is also very connected. I know for myself, I never like actively spouted, misogynistic bullshit, intentionally. I'm sure I did unintentionally all the time. I've become very aware of how I was raised in a culture of toxic masculinity and trying to unpack that, and then I'll never be done unpacking it. But my dad never sat me down and said, "You're a man, and so you get to be in charge." But that was absolutely the message I got for a lot of my childhood.
Mm.
And I distinctly remember having moments, probably starting in college, where the idea that like maybe I shouldn't talk as much because I thought I was just adding my voice to the conversation, but maybe I was kind of drowning out some of the women in the group, that maybe I should step back a bit. Like, it hurt the first time someone told me that,
Mm.
because I was like, wait, no, but I thought I'm just doing my own thing. And like, I think that's one of those, like, the lack of status you're talking about, that like for a lot of, we don't even think about how much we've internalized those things. That can go for gender, for race, for orientation, for any of those things. For being from the inner core and not one of these outer rim worlds, whatever it is. For being a Jedi. I don't know if you've read any of the High Republic books. I think you haven't, but we've told you about them.
Yeah.
One of the things that is talked about in those, and also I think most brilliantly actually in the book about Count Dooku, is that for some Jedi, they really do get this idea of they are better. They are the guardians. They are the people who everyone else should count on. And so how dare them not be grateful?
Mm-hmm.
And that thought is a big part of what leads to the hubris and the problems and the condescension that has a lot of the rest of the galaxy not actually thinking so well of the Jedi, and that leads to, Palpatine being able to do what he did. And I think that just became a kind of victim blaming narrative, and that's not what I mean at all. And that part, I think the metaphor very much breaks down. But I do think it's just one more example of kind of what you're talking about, is that like when you're used to being in a position of power, it shouldn't threaten you, but it is, people do feel threatened by others getting power, others getting respect, others getting to have a voice. And you can embrace that, or you can really reject it. And that gets to really bad places.
For sure. I felt like that was a complete thought, and
yeah,
it was well expressed, and
perfect. So going on with that theme some more, let's start talking about how, like, as you said, how we kind of grew up into more and more Star Wars. Because I think one of the other things I learned about Star Wars is that when people are oppressed, when there's an empire, you fight back. And, as I got into high school and started studying more and learning more about history, and I went to a fairly progressive high school, so we were taught about, like, that the British Empire wasn't always good and right, and, the colonial struggles against it. And I saw them I think I wrote a paper for my high school teacher that was like, it was supposed to be about one of the African rebellions against the British, and it was probably 2/3 about Star Wars and 1/3 about how this particular rebellion was very much like Star Wars. And my professor was like, can you talk about the actual history some more? But yeah, I think I got like a C+ in that paper or something. But like, it was easy for me to see those things. But the other thing that I learned was that rebellions win, particularly
right.
because at that age, I saw one of the great rebellions against tyranny was the American Revolution, which I think in some ways it was, in some ways it really wasn't. It's all sorts of things like that. But the British Empire was thrown back. The Soviet Empire was thrown back. I was maybe 11 when the Berlin Wall fell, and that was such a great, victory for freedom. And then I watched Star Wars, and Star Wars isn't the only movie about a plucky group of revolutionaries who, defeat the evil empire. Like most sci-fi movies that are like big mainstream, big battles, it might be like a fantasy knight stabbing his sword through the, evil emperor, or it might be, a space captain shooting his lasers against the evil emperor. But either way, the empires fall. I'm wondering if you had any of that, and because for me, what I'm building to is, it was a real kind of slap in the face of realizing like that's not always true, and that actually it's not anywhere near as easy as those movies can make it out to be.
Yeah, I don't know if I really took that away as like a lesson. I took that away as like a template for fiction, that I enjoyed and I still enjoy, and that's kind of why I don't enjoy the entirety of the timeline in some ways, right? And we could get to that, but at the same time, it's kind of why I do respect the overall idea of the whole timeline, where a rebellion can win and then not stick, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like World War One and World War Two, um, I'm not sure what age I really kind of learned about them, but kind of that understanding of like there was World War One, and Germany was defeated, even though like it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't, the Third Reich, right? It wasn't like that wasn't quite what was going
Right.
on in World War One. Although I think the United States liked to paint Germany as just as evil in World War One as it was in World War Two.
Yeah.
But then, as a result of the way the period between those wars went, you know, due to a lot of things, obviously, but you know, there was a World War II. Like Germany came
Mm-hmm.
back, right? There was a second Sino-Japanese war, right? There was like
Yeah.
it wasn't like one and done. Oh, the war's over. That's it. Everything's fixed. It's like that's not
Mm-hmm.
how it works. It's like there tend to just be ongoing wars throughout human history, and like one group might conquer another one, but then often something else happens and maybe a third group comes in and conquers them both, or the
Yeah.
conquered group rebels, and then whatever happens, or there's a revolution, and
Mm-hmm.
and so I do feel like I enjoyed the story of like a um a successful rebellion, right?
Yeah.
And kind of not seeing the messiness that happens after that. Like obviously Star Wars is, there's an emperor who
Mm-hmm.
has exceptional powers that extend beyond political power, right?
Right.
And so him going down along with everybody on the Death Star and his number, his right hand man, Vader, disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
Like it makes sense that the Empire would kind of be kaput.
Yeah.
Um, but when it comes to, and the whole, the Imperial fleet's there and everything, right? There's a whole bunch going on. So
Yeah.
it makes some sense there. But when it comes to, real life, it's like I don't think I necessarily learned that lesson. Like, I don't think I necessarily
Yeah.
saw that in Star Wars and then thought, "Oh, that's just what happens." I mean, I did feel like, "Oh, okay, you know, the the colonies defeated the British Empire and then
Mm-hmm.
kicked it out." And that, I do think that was a fight against tyranny. But
Yeah.
the lesson from that is like, well, just because some people defeat some tyrant doesn't mean they won't continue their own form of
Yeah.
oppression, right? And I being pretty much an anarchist
Mm-hmm.
politically, like see pretty much all governments as some form of oppression, and with a
Right.
varying level of buy-in from their population. And it's
Right.
never 100%. Well, it's almost never. There's ones that, there's supposedly everything has
Mm-hmm.
to be by consensus or whatever. But like those are obviously smaller than a large
Yeah.
nation. But like the fact that there's not always 100% buy-in means that there always is going to be there's some complexity to like what's actually going
Right.
on there. But like sometimes there's very little buy-in, right? Most
Yeah.
of the time, I feel like throughout human history, it has been some group has seized a large amount of power and then wielded that against often a larger group of people to keep
Right.
them down and to kind of stand on their heads essentially. And
Yeah.
like
And often it's because they might have been oppressed by that larger group, or they just
quite
fear they're going to
possibly.
be oppressed,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
like
It can be a cycle for sure.
there's a couple of political things that were very big in like Paul and I are just about the same age, and we're very big in our like high school years. That definitely shaped a lot of my thinking about this. And then I want to get to kind of what you're saying about it, the different lesson that you and I took, or that a lesson I took that you didn't necessarily take, because I think it actually has a lot to do with how we feel about a lot of the later works. Um, but in the mid '90s, um, there were a lot of pretty horrific conflicts happening around the world, and two of the worst were in the former Yugoslavia, and all those Yugoslav states, Serbia and Bosnia and Montenegro and Croatia and all those. And the other was Rwanda.
I'm not sure if we're still streaming and everybody else can hear me and Matthew froze, or if I froze, but
Apologies to that, folks. I have been pretty much off caffeine for the last couple months. Last night, I was staying up pretty late and had a Diet Pepsi nearby and didn't want to get up and try to find some other thing and just wound up drinking the Diet Pepsi. And I'm a little bit fidgety today. And it turns out that being fidgety while the switch to your power cord is right under your feet and your feet are fidgeting is a bad combination. So yeah, I'm back. In these conflicts in Rwanda and Serbia and all those, I think one of the things that I really learned is that, that one of the things I think I figured out looking at these conflicts in Rwanda and Serbia and all these places, and again, I was like in high school, maybe I should have figured it out a long time ago, but I was a dumb kid. That one of the things that I picked up from things like Star Wars and a lot of the others, and it's not that I blame them because they're fun stories, but is that if there's an emperor, if there's an empire, if there are bad people, then the people fighting against them are good people. And that's a pretty clear delineation. And I was by no means an expert on, South Central Europe or Eastern Africa. But I know one thing that we saw more, especially in the Yugoslav states, was that like one group would be oppressing another. And so like people would like try to send arms and help to the people who were being oppressed. And they'd be like, cool, thanks. Now we're going to turn around and fuck over this other group. And like there were a number of different world situations where like, when you dug deeper, you found that like the group that was really screwing over the other, it wasn't because they were worse people. It was because they had more of an ability to screw over the other. And that's by no means always true. And I think that can lead to a moral relativism of everyone's bad. And I don't mean it that way. But it really got me to a point of like, oh, wait a minute. Like just because you fight the bad guys doesn't mean that you're the good guys. And that also a lot more often, like you said, the bad guys aren't just jackbooted thugs who are saying, wahaha, ultimate power. They're often a lot more like Vader, and they think that they're doing the right thing. All of which is leading to a question I want to put to you. Because as we talked about, I do like a lot of the kind of later timeline stuff, especially the stuff that's really kind of making complexity out of everything and like moral grayness in the Jedi and all that. And I wonder if it's because for me, part of what it feels like is because I did have this feeling from the original movies of things are simple and the rebellion will always win. And then when I had a moment of like, but that's not always true. Now I'm getting Star Wars stories that agree with me, that say it's not always true. And you can be fighting, you can be the Guardians of Peace in the Galaxy and still become just as fucked up as anyone else. And, that there can be decent people who are fighting against you because they were taught to hate you for the wrong reasons and all this kind of stuff.
There was a question, right? That you were building.
Yeah. As I guess my question is kind of like, does that, would that make any sense to you as a part of like why we see that differently? Because for me, like there's a vindication and I like, oh, okay, finally we're getting that. Whereas you never kind of needed that from Star Wars.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that like to begin with, I don't think I learn a lot of lessons from fiction. I think I more get inspired by it or entertained, but like it tends to be more of a broader kind of inspiration and a feeling and kind of ideas and like a vibe more than like, now I see this other thing differently because I saw this story, not that that can never happen, and certainly I think seeing stories from different people's points of view and it can be powerful to kind of understand or like just a story that takes place in a culture that I haven't really spent time in, and then especially if that story it comes from that culture, right? And is a authentic representation to some extent, I think that, but that's less of like a big life lesson and more of just like a kind of just understanding subtleties about how people feel and people's experiences and whatnot. But yeah, I would say that I didn't like take away, maybe because I didn't take that one thing away from Star Wars. And I'm trying to remember kind of when I had the feeling of like, oh, everyone's awful, or like not that literally everyone's awful, but that like pretty much every power structure humans have ever devised that has had a substantial amount of power has at times used that power poorly to do harm, in ways that I think are bad. And
Right.
that tends to be what happens when you get large groups of humans together working together. Like, it is possible to accomplish amazing things, but
Right.
those amazing things can also be horrible things, right? It can be
Yeah.
impressively horrible things. Um,
I mean, I'm much more pro government, I think, than you
yeah,
are in a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
ways. I have a lot of similar ideas, but I'm much more of a socialist than I am an
Mhm.
anarchist. But even I'll acknowledge that, like, even in the most like positive, like, places like, Scandinavia before they started backtracking a lot of things like that, like, I can look at what feels like a general acceptance by the populace that this is the best way to make things better for the whole country, and also understand that at the very bedrock of that is the idea that you have to give the government a certain amount of your money, and if you don't, men with guns are going to come and either do you harm or put you in jail
Right, right.
or take your
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
And like, yeah, to me that I think that kind of is kind of what you're getting at about the idea, like, even the most benevolent, like 99% of the government agrees with
Yeah.
it. Like, there is still on some level a threat that government is using to get people to go along with their
Yeah,
program.
that and the fact that there's not an opt-in, right? Like,
Right.
you're born somewhere in the world and that country claims you basically as a possession. They call you a citizen, but there's basically an idea that you belong to that country. And then
Right.
it is possible to like change teams, but it's very
Yeah.
difficult. And a lot of people are
Yeah.
probably going to be angry at you about it and then
Mhm.
probably persecute you in the new place more in some places than others. It's going to be harder in some places than others. Depends on
Mhm.
where you're from, also how much money you have, et cetera, et cetera. But it's yeah. I mean, my kind of government take is kind of like, well, they exist, so
Yeah.
they're gonna use their power. So hopefully they'll at least use it for something useful that benefits most
Mhm.
people and is not, persecuting others, right? And so like
Right.
I'm not for it as a this is the way it has to be and this is the only way that humans can live together peacefully,
Mhm.
because I wouldn't call it peacefully really, but like an acceptance of like, yeah, that's where we are. So
Right.
while that's the case, like let's try and do the best with it we can. I definitely think Scandinavian governments are much better than US governments, state
Mhm.
governments and whatever. Um, but at least in terms of like doing things that I think are good for the majority of the people and even almost all of the people. Um, but yeah, in terms of like the later stories and also the earlier stories that are more nuanced, I
Right.
love nuanced stories, but I also love
Mhm.
simple stories. Basically,
Yeah.
my demand is that like you pick you choose what story you want to tell and then you do a good job of telling it. You commit to a way of delivering that story and then you do it. And
Yeah.
I think I don't know if you want to call it an issue or a challenge or whatever with Star Wars is that because it has existed longer than our lifetimes, right? It's existed
Mhm.
close to a half century now. And because that'll be a big thing, right? They've got to have some big movie coming out in like 27, right? I mean,
Oh,
how
I'm
can you
sure,
miss
yeah.
that? But like because it's existed over so long, because there have been so many storytellers, because
Mhm.
it's been owned by a person and then a corporation and then well yeah just a corporation now, but like
Right.
because it's changed hands and there've been all the books and whatever. I find it hard to accept all of those stories as one continuity, and like
Mhm.
I kind of want certain stories to be like, well, what I do is I just kind of group them, and so like as
Yeah.
far as the sequel trilogy, I think the idea of this relapse into fascism is a very powerful idea, a
Yeah.
very tragically relevant idea today. Like that somebody
Mhm.
can come into power and be pursuing fascism and then go out of power and then somehow return and be
Yeah.
back in power like that. that kind of just happened yesterday. So like,
Yeah.
but it's depressing. Like that's not the story
Yeah.
I want to see. And the thing is, like, at first I found that upsetting, but then I
Hmm.
realized I didn't need any more stories. Well, I thought I didn't need any more stories until I saw the end of Mandalorian season 2 and then all of Andor season 1, and it turns out I definitely needed more stories. But like
Yeah.
but those were the stories I didn't know I needed. But like I do think on some level it's like, look, if you're going to have a franchise, if you're going to have some connected universe that I mean, there's got to be hundreds of stories at this point, right? That are like
Yeah.
of the Disney canon, and there's also hundreds that are of the Legends canon. They don't all have to be for everybody. And I feel like
Yeah.
it's a challenge when they take the same characters and then they go through these different hands. I think that's a
Yeah.
challenge, and I don't like that personally because there's a
Hmm.
claim that it's all one continuity. But what I feel like I've been able to do is say, okay, it's not one continuity for me. It doesn't have to be. Like a story
Right.
is what you want it to be, you know? Dexter season 8 doesn't have to happen if you don't want it to happen in your vision of Dexter, you know?
Right.
Like Game of
And I
Thrones
just want to
seasons
add,
8 doesn't have to happen if you don't want that to be, yeah.
I just want to add, because I know this is kind of part of what you're saying, but just to spell it
Yeah.
out even more, this doesn't mean therefore you attack everyone and
Yeah.
anyone who does like the thing you
A
don't like.
hundred
To be
percent.
clear, it's just saying like I, I don't like the last. To me, the Last Jedi doesn't. I'm sorry, very much
The
not.
Last
For
Skywalker? No.
me,
The Rise of
the Rise of
Skywalker?
Skywalker just does not fit my personal
Sure.
continuity. I'm never going to attack
Yeah.
anyone, or like if they're a good friend, I might tease them a
Yeah.
bit, and they'll tease
Sure.
me. You and I
Sure,
do that
sure,
all the
sure.
time, but like I'm not going to ever go online and be like, oh no, that's not in the
Yeah.
canon. Like it's a movie that's made.
Exactly.
But anyway,
And like The Last Jedi is a movie that I know is meaningful to you,
yeah.
right? That you got a lot of value from, and that makes me
Hmm.
happy, even though
Yeah.
I re- I don't only have negative things to say about it. I have a bunch of negative things to say about it that I won't say here. None of them are about the actors or whatever, except the
Yeah.
ones that didn't get as much of a role as they should have because anyway. But the point being, and like I didn't hate Rise of Skywalker. I was like, well, if this is going to be
Yeah.
your trilogy, whatever, fine. I can view that as its own thing. And the idea of this re-rise of fascism and somehow Palpatine has returned and like all of
Yeah.
that. And like it doesn't have to be perfect. Um, and like I might not sit down and watch all 3 movies, but like I can kind of hold that overall as a thing in my head and be like, yeah, that can be its thing.
Mhm.
And I'm really happy that some of that was made for some people that weren't me. Like that's fine. That's cool. I'm
Right.
happy for you. I'm gutted that, so many people who hated the movie, maybe even before it came out, did what they did in terms of harassment. And I mean, that's just
Mhm.
despicable and should never happen. I mean, even if a movie's like really offensive and whatever, like you still like that kind of harassment, like that's not the way. Like attack the story if you don't like the story. Say why you don't
Yeah.
like the story. But like the people involved, like it's like just they're just doing their thing. I know they're just doing their job. I mean, I guess there's
Yeah.
some stories where you can be like, well, but that's the thing. It's like once you go down that dark path. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I feel pretty strongly that like there was a good concept behind the sequel
Mhm.
trilogy and just the whole kind of like post Return of the Jedi idea,
Yeah.
right? It's not all entirely coherent because again, the
Mhm.
management team kept changing in the off season, right? But like they don't all have to be for everybody. And like that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I think you make so many good points there, and I do want to talk specifically about The Last
Mhm.
Jedi and the idea of
Yeah,
hope. I wound up actually watching it. One of the first things I did when I woke up this morning. When I woke up at 1 in the afternoon, really, let's
sure.
be honest. Because I was up all night. And I'll talk about that in a second, but just bringing back for a second, I think you're so right. And like it's amazing to me realizing just how prescient Force Awakens and the world that it built of this, because it's not just that the Empire comes back in the exact same
No.
way. It's that, because like, I think you can draw a really interesting comparison of looking at like, if Reagan is Vader, Reagan and the Emperor are Vader. If
Reagan
the
and
Emperor
Bush
and
are Vader and the Emperor, something like that.
yeah, or just like if like the Emperor and Vader are Reagan era republicanism, and Kylo Ren is Trump era republicanism. You know, it's like Reagan was horrible and had a lot of
Yeah.
ridiculous ideas and was racist and like, you know, made the AIDS crisis so much worse because there's homophobia and like all these things. But he wasn't a clown,
Right.
in the way that like Trump
Yeah.
is.
He was an
And
actor.
yeah, in the same way, I think that like, and there's a wonderful article I read that's talked about how like the whole point of Kylo Ren is that he is overly romanticizing the time when he thinks the universe was great,
Right.
and that he is kind of cosplaying almost the what his memories are of what his parents and his grandparents may have done.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a perfect metaphor for where we are today. And so now I want to talk about The Last Jedi, and this has nothing to do with what it says about Luke, and if you like that or not like that, there's nothing to do with any of the holdo or any of that stuff. I just want to talk about one of the last scenes and the kind of overall message, because for me 2016, like for a lot of people, when Trump was first elected, was a body blow, emotionally in so many ways. It was unexpected, and we can talk all about like how that happened and the polls and stuff like that. But there was just a fundamental sense of like, we all recognize the basic inhumanity of this person and the movement they're leading, and people are just generally better than that. And if we just let people realize just how inhumane and cruel and evil this man and everything he stands for and everyone who surrounds him is, not to mention just how utterly self-serving, that people are going to realize that and do the right thing. And I remember so much of that campaign feeling like, oh, okay, well, now we have the Access Hollywood
Right.
tape. Now we have this new quote from him. Now we have the thing that people finally
surely
realize.
After this, he can't possibly still be electable.
And it never happened.
Yeah, there was no bridge too far.
And
literally getting convicted of a felony, not a bridge too far.
Yeah. But I'm even talking just in
the first one,
2016, before January 6th, before all of that. And so when Leia puts out the call at the end of Last Jedi, and then she learns that no one is coming, that no one is going to answer, I felt that moment in my bones, because it really felt like the same moment of like, just because we're right, just because we're on the right side, doesn't mean that the people are going to rise up. And it might be because a lot of them are scared. It might be because a lot of them don't have the resources to fight back, you know? And I think that was certainly like, for anyone who's hoping there was going to be like a national strike and like massive protests against Trump, like in our economy, a lot of people can't afford to participate in a national strike, or a lot of people are worried of like what's going to happen to their custody arrangements or their immigration status or any of these things, like,
or are unwilling to make that sacrifice, because everyone can go on strike, but doesn't mean everyone can and not be financially devastated or
the consequences might be horrific for them, or might be,
and other people might be like, oh, I'm just going to take a
them.
vacation for a month essentially and call it a strike.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's extremely different for different people,
for sure. And that's always, I think, the balance we have to remember is like, it's good to encourage people, I think, to like, hey, this is really bad, we got to push ourselves out of our comfort zones and push harder, but also be like, hey, if you're going to potentially suffer more from this thing I'm asking you to do, I really got to be careful not to like be like, no, come on, it's not a big deal, you know? But putting all that aside, so just this idea of that it's not, the good guys aren't always going to come and rescue us. And that again, but that throughout that movie, the enduring theme is that even in that time, you can still have hope. Even when you, like the sun at night, you can't see it, you have to believe in it or you'll never get through to the dawn. And 2016 felt really hopeless, and the Trump administration felt really hopeless. And then watching, the hope of like a real leftist populist, response, and that being wiped out, that felt really hopeless. And so for me, at least, that move, and I think that's where I feel today. I think that's where so many of us feel today, because now it's not just Access Hollywood anymore. It's the Supreme Court. It's January 6th, the literal coup attempt. It's the felonies, the sexual assault charges that have been legally decided. I'm seeing from so many folks this sense of just like, I don't get it. How could this be? And a sense of hopelessness.
Yeah.
And for me, and I get it from Rogue One. Like, I'll probably watch Rogue One sometime today or tomorrow, and just when the computerized AI version of Princess Leia turns around and says, "What did they send us? Hope?" I'm tearing up just now talking about it. I'll probably sob like a baby. And I don't know what the hope, because to me, the point is, I have no idea what the hope is against the current situation in the United States. And I don't think Leia had any idea what the hope was.
Right.
But there was still hope. And for me, that's one of the most important messages, because, and I've been going on for a while, I'll stop. I just want to make this one last point. Part of, I think what you were saying about the, like, everyone can rise up if they want to, but for many people, like, the sacrifice is too high, and that we're not like saying that's an illegitimate decision, but that part of how authoritarian governments work, like Tarkin says, is fear.
Yeah.
And that for a lot of people, I think Andor really strikes to this, it's not that they're afraid of the consequences, it's they're afraid of the consequences that they've been taught to fear.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that's always been part of the thing, is that idea of like, we can rise up because they can't attack all of us. We're not, there is a point at which there's more of us, etc. So, end my rant. I'll let you, I don't have a specific question for you,
Sure.
just a general, like,
I remember something Dave Filoni said about getting the job basically to run the Clone Wars, and talking to George Lucas about it, and how it, the Clone Wars is a really depressing story when you go from, point A, season 1 to season 7. Like, the course of that story it's a depressing story. It's a war. I don't know why they're called wars, but anyway, it's like, and a lot of people die, spoilers. And, it's about the Republic going from not much of a democracy to not at all a democracy, And the thing that George Lucas said to Filoni that he said he remembered and tried to maintain was like, don't forget to give them hope, and that really is the central message of Star Wars, I think. So if there is a lesson, I feel like I learned that from the 1986 Mets, to be honest.
That's fair.
There's a podcast on superhero ethics, right, where we, I guess, sports ball, you called it. But I feel like that I learned that message from just seeing these improbable comebacks. But that's also the message of Star Wars, in fiction form, is like, until it's over, it's not over. As long as someone's fighting for change, that change can still happen. And things always change. Things are always constantly in flux. And so you can't control the outcome, but every single person can influence the outcome, Right. And so just the idea that it's worthwhile to make the effort, even if you don't know how it's gonna, it's like, just, the example from it's World Series Game 6 in the 86 World Series was like, I don't want to be the last out. So that's just that person being like, I'm not going to end it here. And the next person was like, I'm not going to be the last out. And basically, the Star Wars is like, I'm not going to be the one who just flies off and is like, oh, whatever, this didn't work. I'm just going to keep going at it. And, eventually one person happens to use the Force and it works really well. And, you got Han Solo. But like, it really is like, I think The Last Jedi, I think, works well because it has that hope of hope, but then it doesn't deliver on that, and it's act 2 of 3, so it leaves you in the lowest point, right? And then that sets up act 3, which I enjoyed a lot, like not a perfect movie, definitely not fully congruous with the rest of just even the sequel trilogy, but that moment when Lando's like, on your left, or I don't remember what he did say, but
there's more of us.
It was
Wedge. There's more of us.
It was basically the same as the end of Avengers Endgame. It's the same of like, it looks like it's down to just this few against the many, and then it turns out actually like someone's got their back, and they're all on the same side, and they're gonna do it together. And that, I do think that's the like, if you have to run at it alone, you could run at it alone, and like there's a good chance someone will come up from behind you because they're also sick of it, and maybe they won't, and that's just it for you, but like maybe that will inspire someone later also.
And I think it's funny because I think, and not to make it about that movie, but for me that one scene is probably the biggest reason I don't like Rise of Skywalker, because for me it felt like it was completely betraying the message of The Last Jedi. And it was saying like, okay, no, I guess to me, there's a difference between hope and blind hope. And blind hope is, if I just keep trying the same way, eventually people are going to recognize my struggle and are going to come up behind me. If I keep just battering myself against this one wall, if I keep just running my Democratic candidate to the center, if I just, whatever I keep trying to do, that eventually the people are going to, or if I keep just, telling people how bad this person is, eventually they'll all come and find me. And for me, the essential part of the hope message is also like, you have to have hope, but then you have to figure out what's going wrong. Why isn't it working? Why aren't they coming? And so I wish, like, it felt to me like the Rise of Skywalker was just saying, oh, just try again. It didn't work that time, but if you try the same thing again, this time they will.
So you're saying it was more Age of Ultron. Well, the first robot we made didn't work out, so let's just make another one, and maybe this one will be good.
Exactly. Exactly. But it's played by Paul Like, if you want to find who's going to figure out who's the good guy, James Spader versus Paul Bettany.
Not a hard choice. Not a hard choice.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want this to go too long with you and I. That's always a joke, but we're going to try and wrap up pretty soon. But let's talk about one last product, because let's talk about one last piece of Star Wars media, because for me, it was such a radically different take on the Star Wars understanding of rebellion, but also was building on things that had been there all along, especially like since the Clone Wars, which is Andor. How did Andor and maybe even also Rogue One kind of feel different to you in terms of what it was saying about rebellion and fighting oppression?
And you said you want to wrap up soon.
This is probably a whole other movie, a whole other episode. But
so
let's at least hit the highlights, and maybe there'll be part 2.
Andor. Yeah, it felt like the same Star Wars from the beginning, but just with more nuance, more texture, less force, no lightsabers, So it felt like it took out the flashiest things and really just cut down to the emotion, the motivation, and it didn't start from the premise, we want a rebellion because a rebellion is what we need or like what we want. Right. Like, I feel like that's Star Wars, the original movies, the later movies, maybe the prequels to the least extent. The prequels actually maybe explain the motivations the most, because something about tariffs and stuff and whatever. But like, I feel like the Star Wars movies are basically like, look, the Empire's oppressive, and so the people want to rebel, and they're the rebellion. Right? Got it? Okay, good. Let's do some cool looking stuff and have some great character moments. But like, it's starting from that point of the assumption, of the rebellion against the Empire? Like, where there's this excited, like, that's a thing.
Right.
And
the morality, or the like, should we actually be rebelling against the Empire? Like, does the Empire good? Like, that's never questioned.
yeah, and like,
Those
do
are
we
just
stand a
understood.
chance? It's like, no, it's the rebellion. We got to do it, right? Because it's the rebellion. And it is questioned by Solo, who's like, better to save your own skin. And then he's like, all right, fine, I'll help the rebellion.
Yeah.
But like, Andor starts from why would I get involved in that? That's a fool's errand, and like,
Mhm.
of course the Empire's terrible, but like, we can't do anything about it. I think
Right.
Andor starts from a place of hopelessness in terms of the possibility of affecting change, right? It's
Yeah.
like, what could we do? What are we going to do against that? Can't do anything against
Right.
that. And it gets to a place, it shows specifically how one person can go through a lot of things, but also how a town or planet, also how a prison of people,
Mhm.
how people can get to the point of like, okay, I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I know not doing it isn't going to work. Like, how a
Right.
person can go from being, just a cynical, we have no chance, so why would we try, to just like, all right, I'm all in, I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if it's going to work, but like, let's do it. And
Yeah.
so I think it takes us on that journey that I don't really feel like any of the movies. And I mean, Rogue One kind of does that fast forward with Jin, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but then Andor does that slow motion with Cassian. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. There's a whole other different point I want to make about those movies and rebellions, but I'm glad you actually came up with this one, because I think this is a great place to start. And I would say actually Rogue One, I think, does have some of that same point, but in microcosm. But the moment of like where Jin goes to the Rebel Council and says like, we have to
yeah,
do this, and they're all like, no, we're too
right.
afraid. And for me, one of the most powerful moments in Andor is when Marva literally speaks from beyond the grave to
Yeah.
everybody. And it's not like mystical. She recorded a message
Yeah.
before she
She
died.
looks like a Force ghost, but she's not.
Right. Because, and here I'm going to talk for a minute about another belief system that is very important to me, where a huge number of the people who are interested in this belief system are complete awful people. That's not me. I'm not sure to reference this, but and I do not care in the slightest whether you share this belief system or all. I'm just going to talk about how it shapes my beliefs. One of my other sort of main influences that I put on the same kind of level as Star Wars is of a guy who came along and said, hey, maybe this Roman Empire isn't the greatest thing in the world, and maybe we should be nicer to each other. And he was killed because of it. The Roman Empire did the worst thing they possibly could to him. And it didn't matter. And some people might say because he was literally risen from the grave. For me, it's much more of an idea of that death couldn't stop the message he was doing. And I'm not saying that the Marva story is a Christian story by any means. I'm just saying the truth I find in that story is, I think, similar to the truth I find in the Marva story of, yeah, the Empire did the absolute worst thing they could to her. They killed her. Because they killed her because they didn't want her to keep agitating against the Empire.
Yeah, they didn't actually kill her. She just died.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
I mean,
Thank you.
maybe, the economic conditions induced by whatever maybe led to her not wanting to turn the heat on enough or whatever, but like, she
that's
did
fair.
actually just die. Like, they killed her husband or the father, Andor's
right.
adopted
That's
father.
definitely true as well. Yeah. Yeah, you are correct in that. So I'm drawing too much of a direct analogy, and it's not quite there. But still, that idea of, yes, some of us may die, and that's horrible and awful, but that can't stop us. That the message can live on, the fight can live on. And again, that doesn't mean I'm saying like I'm not asking other people to volunteer to go out and die. That's a thing we all got to figure out for ourselves how much we can do. I recognize I have a lot of privilege, so there's some things I'm going to publicly do that other people can't necessarily, in terms of like being very outspoken about my pronouns, my transness, and stuff like that. But yeah, to me, that was such a powerful message of Andor, of that, like, because I think part of it is that, like, fear is very individual.
Yeah.
Like, if I am afraid the Empire is going to do something to me, I might recognize that the Empire might also do it to you, but I'm thinking about what it can do to me and not to us. And so much of Andor is about building community, building connections, like the community that Marva was a part of and that Andor was a part of. And there's some major problems with Marva that I talked about at length on the episodes I did about Andor on this podcast a while back. I'm not saying that, but that we can overcome fear, like hope and fear, the diametrically opposed things. And then a lot of that is recognizing, as you said, like there is someone who's going to have your back and someone you're going to have their back.
Yeah. I now I'm thinking of his name as Brazos. Brasso, I think is his name. The buddy who really has Andor's back, like both when he's just getting into little scraps and then later, I mean, he's the one that when they kick over B2, he's like, I'm going to take this brick of Marva and smash it into, an Imperial skull. And
which is such a powerful
amazing.
like I don't think I'm ever going to actually be physically fighting like, jackbooted government troop. But if I am, I know exactly where the urn is that my mother is in, and it's heavy and it's metal and it's going to be all because she would want nothing.
It's amazing. It's so good. It's so good. I love that. But yeah, I mean, it really is about it is about community, and what they've been doing to that community for so long, and basically just collectively rising up spontaneously, in I think a totally believable way, that like and not necessarily all wanting to do that, but just like, then just, it's on, like this is what's happening now. The idea of martyrs, and there's a Suicidal Tendencies song that always called "Give It Revolution" from Lights Camera Revolution, that there's a line, you can put a bullet in my head but you can't kill a word I've said, you've got the disease, I've got the solution, revolution. Anyway, it's like whispered, it's weird, but it's a good song. It's
the name of that band is incredibly ironic given the conversation we're having about who chooses to
for sure. And it's interesting because one of my irks with that song is that it has this whole like kind of religious connotation also, which I had never really connected that with the sort of martyring thing, but I'm like, oh yeah, okay, no, I see kind of where you're coming from with that. And it's true though, it's like you can't kill an idea. Like you can you could suppress it, you could try, but like an idea is ephemeral. It's in the mind. You have to kill all people and all forms of documentation in order to like really, you're still not destroying the idea, but just you're erasing it from access to people, but like, or people's access to it, or people from being able to access it. But like it for sure, I mean, that's I'm done.
That's
I feel like I made a really coherent point about Andor, and then you made a really coherent point about Andor, and then I was like, why don't I just ramble for 2 minutes about
I've certainly done that too. But let me move us into the last topic. The thing I thought we were going to start talking about with Andor, that is for me even more so than what you put out, but actually as I think more about you put out, you're totally right. But is that for me, Andor and starting with Rogue One, and I think there's a direct link, is really about the idea that rebellions are going to be pure and good and right and done by good people who you love and support, and that we're only going to do violence for the most noble of reasons, is absolute bloody horseshit. And that there's always this attempt to be like, well, we don't like the way these people are fighting for freedom now, because why aren't they as good as, such and such? And Nelson Mandela blew up buses and plazas in South Africa as part of the ANC's campaign. The acts that were, deemed terrorist, they were done as part of the fight against South African apartheid. A fight I think I certainly hope anyone listening to this is very much in favor of. And we look back and we say, yeah, that was part of the necessary fight, and it was horrible, but like that was what we had to do. Or at least some do, or we just forget about it. We utterly ignore it, and we think only of Nelson Mandela as this very Gandhi-like peaceful activist, which he was. But he was very clear. He never said the violence I did earlier was morally wrong. He said it's not strategic.
Right.
And same, like, look at any like rebellion that we want to sort of valorize and honorize, and there's terrible things that happen during it. And I think of this when I think about the fact that like I can be horrified and disgusted by what the media tells me happened on October 7th. And I do think like the media portrayal of it is, somewhat accurate, if very overblown, and not overblown, but there's a whole other thing there. Some stories have definitely been falsified, but still, like, 1,200 innocent people were murdered as part of a struggle against what I think is horrifically awful oppression. And and to pull it to the Star Wars, like Cassian Andor early in that movie, Rogue One, realizes that this person who is an utter hero, he has brought him the information he needs to help deal with this Death Star and start the whole process in motion. And this guy's a hero. This guy is awesome.
He did this thing. We don't know his whole story. Maybe he just shot someone else to, whatever.
Sure, but yeah, like he's clearly like working on Andor's side, but that he's gonna make it so that Andor can't escape, and he shoots him in the back. And he's clearly morally troubled by it, but he does it. And I think the most brilliant thing about Andor, the show, is that it puts Mon Mothma forward as the Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. No, actually not, because she's very much like we have to work within the system, work within the Senate. And then puts forward Luthen, who is very happy to sacrifice 250 people who believe in his cause because he thinks it'll be strategic.
Yeah, or entirely willing.
Right. And this 250 people do not sign up and say, yes, let us do this. And he's not wrong. Like, that's the thing that really gets to me, is that I think part of what that show is about is saying it would be easier to just say he is right and Mon Mothma's wrong, or Mon Mothma's right and he is wrong. But the truth is, like, rebellions, you have both. And we're not going to actually tell you which one is right and which one is wrong. We're just going to say, this is what goes into having a rebellion. And I think Clone Wars had already started that with like putting Saw Gerrera against, sort of the Republic and things like that. And I just think it's been a through line since then, but that Andor especially really drove home for me. There are going to be people who do things you don't like while fighting the oppression that you're fighting. And that doesn't mean you have to blindly support all of them. It doesn't mean you have to blindly condone all of them. But the stuff we watched as kids told us that rebellions were going to be clean and nice and noble, and that's just not always true.
Yeah. I mean, aside from like, the janitors and stuff on the Death Star and stuff, right? But like, I do think that like...
Which it took Kevin Smith to get us to think about.
Well, I guess. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like maybe some other people thought of that about that first too. But Kevin Smith definitely popularized the notion, right?
The movies don't show us that.
That's true. 100%. What the thing I'd say about Andor that I really appreciate, aside from everything about Andor, is that I don't feel like the show is telling us Luthen's right. It's not telling us Mon Mothma's right. It's not telling them anyone's wrong, except for like, Dedra Meero. It's like, no, she's wrong. Like, we got you to empathize with her a little bit by like putting her in her spot, but this isn't good, But like, in terms of the rebels, it really is just like, this is a rebellion, this is what it looks like. And you have whatever feelings you want, you have your own feelings about it. And the show isn't going to tell you it's supposed to be this way, it's supposed to be that way. And that is the thing about rebellions and revolutions, and is there are different ways of going about it. And you can look at
Yeah.
something and try and, think about it morally or ethically or tactically or strategically. And it's like, certain things you can say, well, I don't think that was a good idea. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
but maybe that was the only idea that person had. So should they have done nothing or should they have done that? I don't know. And a lot
Yeah.
of times you'll hear in fighting all sorts of forms of oppression, like, oh, well, I don't think that was constructive. I think
Sure.
that was counterproductive. And I think sometimes that's true. I think a lot of times
Yeah.
the ways people react to oppression can be counterproductive. It can be at least not constructive.
Yeah.
I don't think it has to be. Sometimes a reaction to oppression is not a strategic attempt to end that oppression. Sometimes it's just a reaction to oppression, right? It's like
Yeah.
it's not necessarily rational because it's not a rational situation to be in. It's emotional. It's a reaction.
Yeah.
But um the thing that I just think is really good storytelling about Andor is that it leaves it to the viewer. It's like, here's a story. It's a really well
Yeah.
told story with nuance and complexity and different characters who are maneuvering and trying to go about get the same ends through different
Mm-hmm.
means. And
Yeah.
there's discussion about is this how we want to do it? Is that how we want to do it? Like, do you even want to know how we want to do it? Or do you just want us to do it and then you don't have to think about it?
Right.
And there's different answers for every person.
Yeah. And and it can spark discussion about
Yeah,
that,
for sure.
because I think that's the whole thing. Like, I think we should be having discussions about, like, okay, let's talk about how do we fight against the oppression in our lives. Well, here's this interesting model. Like, do you think yourself more of a Mon Mothma or more of a Saw Gerrera or more of, like, I don't think that, like, I don't saying that every person fighting oppression has to watch
Yeah, yeah,
Andor,
yeah.
but I'm saying if you've watched it and someone else has watched it, like, that's a good way to frame it. Or Star Trek is like, so many works of literature have stories
Yeah,
like
and I
this,
would say less than trying to figure out who you are in the story. I think one of the values of that story or a story like that is
Mm-hmm.
I think it can help understand other people coming at the same problem from a different angle.
Yeah.
I think it can make it easier to understand, okay, I know where I'm coming from, but I see how another person could be coming from a different way. And
Right.
I might disagree with that. And so maybe I find that character really irritating. But as that character is a very well developed person with a life and everything going on,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe they're not, maybe they're kind of opaque and we don't really know who they are and they're mysterious. But
Right.
like, I think it really can. I think that's one of the biggest powers of storytelling is letting people spend time with characters who allow them to understand diverse motivations, right? That different
Right.
people would view something differently, would think about going about something in a different way. Um,
Yeah.
you know.
And I think that especially is such an important lesson for us right now, because yeah, those are the fights that I see all the time and on all sides, because there's the, like, if you don't fully support exactly what Israel is doing, then you must be completely in support of, Hamas and all that, instead of having any understanding of, like, actually, I think this is bad for, whatever it is. But also on the left of, like, oh, well, if you don't vote in this particular way, then clearly you want Trump to win, or you don't care about
Yeah.
Palestine, or like whatever it is. To me, I think what I liked about Andor is it's in the mud. It gets away
Mhm.
from ideas of purity. And so many of us want to feel like that's the way we solve this, is by being the most pure
Mhm.
activists, the most perfectly pro-Palestine, the most perfectly pro-abortion rights, the most, like, and not everyone's in the same place and everyone's going to compromise. One of my favorite quotes on dealing with oppression or just any kind of, like, attempt to work towards things is saying, it's from Bishop Yvette Flunder, who's the bishop of this fantastic queer positive, trans positive church in San Francisco, and it's got like a lot of smaller churches. That's why she's a bishop of it. She's Black, a lesbian herself. And what she says is a whole bunch of people moving in the same direction for different reasons is a movement. A whole bunch of people moving in the same direction for the same reason is a cult. And that has always really struck with me of like, it's okay if I'm upset about the oppression because of this and you're upset about it because of that. And like, we have different goals about exactly what the next thing that's going to come along would look like. But we both think that what's happening right now is wrong. And you might want to fight it in a way that I don't. And we got to figure that out. But just to get rid of the, like, it does, like, because I don't think there's any question that Lucian and Mon Mothma and Saw Gerrera all, and Cassian Andor all hate the Empire and all want to see it overthrown. They just all have different methods of doing it and different ways of doing it and different understandings.
And also different end games. Like, I mean, I'm not sure Cassian wants the Republic to return as it was. Like, his planet was destroyed by the Republic, not by the Empire. He doesn't see this bright line between the Republic and the Empire. He's like, this is this huge oppressive group, you know?
Yeah.
And Mon Mothma's like, oh no, we just need to restore democracy to its previous greatness, you know?
Whereas, like, I don't want to go back to 2015.
Yeah.
Like, that was
right. Exactly. It's like that.
There's
no rewind spot that's like, yeah, stop it right there. Like, that's not, no, you need to, it's fast forward. You need to fast forward and see, like, okay, is there any point on the tape when it's like, okay, here, let's hit play here. That quote, I've heard that quote before. I don't really totally agree with it, but like, I respect the main sentiment. I feel like a group of people can have the same reasons for wanting the same thing. And like, that's not necessarily a cult. That's maybe just a bunch of people who agree on something. But I think it can be a cult. And I think, you know, maybe there's like maybe you need more caveats, and then I would agree with it.
Yeah, like I think when, like, I heard her give a whole sermon on it, and she talked about the idea of like when they're all thinking the same way, when they're all coming from the same place, when they're all coming from the same background. That's more what you're getting at.
That's different. That's a little more specific. I need those details.
You want nuance.
I want the nuance. Give me the nuance.
Yeah. No, that's what I like. Well, this has been a great discussion, Paul. Thank you so much. This has been, you know, this is a hard day, and this conversation honestly has been good for me today, and I hope it's been good for you and for your listeners. I hope it's been really helpful. And would love to hear your thoughts, like either about what are the ways that this story inspires you, or what are other stories that are inspiring you, or where are you finding your hope, or, you know, anything like that. I'll give kind of some plugs and just say, like, I think this is a really good time to be trying to start building that community. One of Paul and I's good friends from high school, who we've both stayed close to. Paul, you stayed a lot closer. You've been in bands with him and the like. You've been in bands with them and the like. Logan does some great work on his TikTok. He's just this incredible channel about like moving beyond just thinking voting will save us, and building community and organizing and stuff like that. I don't agree with everything he always says, but that's the whole point. He makes me they make me think in ways that are super important and super needed. One thing I've been looking a lot is how to help people who are in red states that need to get out, trans folks or people with reproductive issues, or, you know, anything like that. I'll post links to some of those funds and things like that. What are the things that you're doing? What are you doing to help? And if right now what you're doing is just rocking back and forth in a fetal ball trying to get through the moment, that's totally okay too. You know, and if what you need to do is just go rewatch the Ewoks 8 times, do it. Nub. Yeah. I would get, you know, talk about oppression. I would 100% put Yub Nub, the ultimate moment of like singing freedom from the Empire, but the big mouse, which is another form of oppression, would come down on us with a lot of like, you talk about the mouse being too woke. I talk about the mouse being like an empire.
Yeah, for sure. Is it even trademarked anymore or copyrighted now that they've erased it from the movie?
Maybe. I don't know. I'll check into it. I'll check into it.
It shouldn't be. When you overwrite your own movie, then that part of it should become public domain. That's a new.
Yes, I think that's true. Deleted scenes. You know, you're like, you didn't want it, so but.
Exactly, you've relinquished.
It's like grocery stores throwing out food and not wanting anyone to take.
Right.
You know, to take.
Yeah,
it.
Once you throw it out, it's for the freegans.
Yeah. but grocery stores dump poison on that shit, and Disney does that to its deleted scenes.
Awful.
Anyway, okay, this metaphor's
There's a
going way
Mon
too far.
Mothma deleted scene in Revenge of the Sith.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, there totally is. And it's actually a really good scene for Padme.
Right, yeah.
Which, by the way, I'll say one of the best things I've
Who
sing in
could have
terms
been
of
a
like
character
meme.
in that movie if they'd included that
It
scene?
would have been nice. I one of the best things I've seen is and it was addressed to women, but I think it's true of all genders. If you think that you can date your Trump voter and eventually get them to be better, just look what happened to Padme.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind. We're gonna do a quick bonus content about some other media that's out there that might similarly be inspiring us or thinking about it coming to mind. But if you're not part of that, please you can become a member to get our bonus content. $5 a month, $55 a year. Think about becoming a member, but honestly, frankly, if you've got $5 to give, I'd much rather you give it to something like Trans Lifeline than to our membership. Become a member at some point, but there's other things that are needed right now, I think a little bit more. But you do get the bonus content. We'll have that for our members, for whom we are so thankful. For everybody else, please write in. Please let us know your thoughts. Please let us know how you're doing. We have spoken.
Yub dub.
There's never a way to stop the music. Stop the signal.
No, you quoted Flotsam and Jetsam by accident. It's amazing.
I love it.
If you're gonna be hard on us, we're gonna be hard on you. Or if you're hard on us, we're gonna yeah. It's from No Place for Disgrace.
Yeah.
The second Flotsam and Jetsam album.
I'll
record,
check it out.
Whatever.
All right. We're out.